And here we are for lesson 3 of our wonderful course. I'm enjoying it so much. Hope you are as well. So let's begin by dedicating today's class, thanking our course sponsors, Nancy Trias, Beth and Eli Morocco, and Toby and Larry Fox. Thank you for sponsoring the course. And today's class specifically, hello Lance, we want to dedicate today's class in loving memory of Chana Bas Leibish. Nancy, is it Label? Leibish sounds like a nickname. Okay, whatever, Leibish. I call my label sometimes Leibush.
This is Nancy's
That's my little
mother-in-law.
And this is Nancy's mother-in-law. So just passed away last week, so let this class be the Ilui Nishmasa, something that will bring comfort and an ascent to her soul. And with that, let us get going with lesson 3, where East met West, or meets West, the chosen city of Jerusalem. So the story goes like this. The IRS audits a Jewish bakery out of New Jersey. This guy named Moshe. He has a little bakery and they come and start auditing. And he says, I only make $80,000 a year. You don't have to come, you don't have to come after me and start harassing me. You're not going to find any big fish over here. So they say, we don't mind your income, but you're writing off these deductions on business trips. 9 trips to Jerusalem. What's up with that? So he says, don't you see outside it says we also do free delivery? So Jerusalem, that's what we're going to be talking about. If you look back at the story of the 6-Day War, both from the perspective within Israel, and even more inside from the perspective of the soldiers, as well as the Jews in the diaspora all around the world. We look back at that moment not just as one of Jewish pride, which is definitely one. It brought a tremendous pride to the Jewish people that we're able to defend ourselves and fight and win in such a victorious way. But there's also a certain euphoria, just such an excitement that comes along with it. And that is undoubtedly attributed to the liberation, the reunification of Jerusalem. There's actually a whole story. There's many different ways how to, words in general, and today in the political climate, we see that especially. The choice of words makes a very big difference in the way you frame an issue. Is it the conquest of Jerusalem? That's my reminder, shut off my ringer. Okay. Is it the liberation, right? Which one is it? Did we conquer? Did we occupy? If you ask the UN, the current status of Jerusalem, of Israel's control in Jerusalem, is as occupying Palestinian territory. That is actually how the UN, for the most part, that's how they consider it. We look at it as, that didn't work, I guess. We look at it as the liberation of Jerusalem, right? Very different wording. In fact, there's a whole story, without going into the whole story now, there is a story of the paratroopers. They were outside of the old city. It was the night before they were going to go in. I'll talk about it soon, but the battle surrounding the old city was very, very difficult. A lot of soldiers got killed. There was a lot of loss of life to get Jerusalem, especially around it. So that night they were taking refuge in a Jewish home outside of the old city. And the grandma of the home, a woman quite elderly, goes over to the paratroopers and asks, are you planning on storming the old city tomorrow? And they honestly did not know them. There's a lot of speculation amongst the soldiers. Are we going to go in? Are we not going to go in? There's all this excitement and tension, and nobody knew. It was a very last minute call from the defense minister. That's it, we're going in. But initially, the IDF did not want to go into the old city. There's no reason for us to do it. So she gave one of the paratroopers an Israeli flag and said, I used to live in the old city of Jerusalem. What happened was that in 1948, the War of Independence started, which is right when Israel declared their independence. All the Arab armies fought against Israel. It's known as the War of Independence, a very, very difficult war. And Israel lost Western Jerusalem, the old city, including the old city of Jerusalem. And Jordan kicked out all the Jewish inhabitants, and they destroyed all the synagogues, and they defiled the cemetery right outside. And she says, I used to live in the old city of Jerusalem, and I was one of the last people leaving. And I took down the last flag that was hanging there. And I want this to be, again, the very first flag hanging. And there's a video of it, and the paratroopers made sure to hold on to it, even through the fighting. And right on top of the kotel, when they liberated it, they hung it up. We'll actually see the video of that in a moment. And his commander said, write something on it, you have a flag, this is a momentous. So he wrote the date. He wrote, this is the first flag that we're hanging up after the conquest of Jerusalem. And he right away, he writes in his memoirs, he crossed out that word and he wrote the liberation of Jerusalem. So there's no question about it. The first day of the war, when Israel started when they saw very quickly that evening that Israel is successful in the Sinai and the threat of total annihilation is gone, that brought a sigh of relief to the Jewish people. But the euphoria that came along with the Six-Day War was undoubtedly because of Jerusalem. But this brings us into today's topic. It is one of the most hotly contested issues of today, Jerusalem. I want to make today's class, I want to ask two questions that will drive today's class. Question number one is, everybody at that time of the Six-Day War, as one Israeli soldier said it, everybody in Israel became religious on the day that we liberated the Kotel. Everybody in Israel became religious. It tugged everybody's heart. We know that it began an entire spiritual awakening throughout the world in the former Soviet Union. Just that image that we reclaimed the old city, the Kotel, the Temple Mount. Until today, people go to the Kotel and they say, I've never felt a sense of transcendence until I went to the Kotel. You feel holiness. So what is it? What is it what is it about the Kotel, about Jerusalem, about the Temple Mount that captures the heart and soul of every single Jew? That's question number one. And I'll just tell you, there's a wonderful book that Max lent to me, titled The Lion's Gate. It's a wonderful book. It's personal accounts from the soldiers that fought in the Six-Day War. So it's not a book that goes through systematically the whole story of the war. He actually writes very clearly in the beginning of the book that it's not comprehensive at all, but you really get a feeling for the soldiers, and it's a wonderful book. And I couldn't put it down. I already finished it. I finished it in record timing. Okay. So there's one soldier there that says, he describes the excitement. They're on the bus and they're heading, the whole team of paratroopers, to the old city of Jerusalem. At that point, they still do not know if they're conquering the old city. At that point, their orders were only to secure the roads around Jerusalem, to not allow any Jordanian tanks to come and continue shelling the Israeli part, East Jerusalem. But any sense of conquest, that was not on the table yet. But all the soldiers were talking, and there was a lot of talk. And every single soldier, every single paratrooper that was on their way to fight the Jordanians in Jerusalem, every single one describes this. They were all singing on the bus the song, which was then brand new, of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. It's a modern song, Jerusalem of Gold. They're all singing, and there's all this chatter. Are we going to take it? Are we not going to take it? And this one soldier, he says, none of us could help it. There were such butterflies in our stomach, such an excitement. We're going to go into the old city. But the soldier says, I don't even know why I care about Jerusalem. I love the way he says it. I'm so excited, but I don't even know why I care. And I think that captures a lot of our feelings sometimes. We know that we care, but why do we care? So what is that secret? What is the hold of Jerusalem on our hearts? And question number two is, I want to look at this class from the perspective of what's happening in the world today. We've liberated Jerusalem, not through a war of aggression, but through a war of defense. We won fair and square. The Jordanians signed the papers that gave us full control over Jerusalem. In fact, we were the ones, the Jewish people, the Israeli government, gave back control of the Temple Mount back to the Jordanian Waqf, which is a separate story, if it was right or wrong. But we were the ones that relinquished control over our Temple Mount, but we got it. And Israel from then started saying, here's where we have the term of a unified Jerusalem. Jerusalem has to stay intact. Jerusalem can't be split. There's no East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. It's one city, and Israel says this is our capital. From then, Israel says it's their capital. In 1980, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that clearly says our capital is the unified Jerusalem. But the world doesn't accept it. The world refuses to accept it. The UN said that the Knesset bill is null and void. They don't have the right to call Jerusalem their capital. And indeed, most countries till today still do not, still will not concede or recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So we know very recently, America just recently moved their embassy, which was a very, very big move, right? And only now, I think it's still that way, right? If you were born in Jerusalem, your American passport say Jerusalem, Israel. It used to just say Jerusalem. Didn't say that you come from Israel. And interestingly, even before America, who was the only country that recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Russia. Isn't that interesting? They said, look, reality is reality. They said, we'll recognize West Jerusalem, which was always Israel's part, the west part. We'll recognize that as their capital. So it's interesting, ironically, that Russia was the one, you know what? Let's concede to reality. They say it's their capital, we'll say it's their capital. But everybody else says, no, we don't want to take a position on it. And most people say that we're not going to recognize anything until there's some form of negotiation. At the more negative side of it, the UN, for the most part, as I mentioned, looks at Jerusalem as occupied Palestinian territory. So,
the entire city, or
the entire city, but mainly east. But the idea of the concept of a unified Jerusalem is looked at as occupation. Which, by the way, we'll be talking about occupations next week more in depth. But today the topic is Jerusalem. So, why is it that Jerusalem is so important to us? Why is this something that we will not negotiate over? And you know, it's very interesting. Israeli prime ministers, almost every single one, even the ones that were very willing to give up land for peace, they said, but a unified Jerusalem, we're not negotiating on that. So we're talking about somebody like Yitzhak Rabin, who very famously was willing to go to very big extremes for peace. He was willing to give up the entire West Bank, but he said, but not Jerusalem. Not Jerusalem. Okay, so what is it about Jerusalem? Why is it so important to us? Historically, practically, why is it our capital? And just what makes it so hot? What makes it so hot of an issue? So what I want to do with you today, in the next little bit, is go through simply, in today's class, I'll just tell you in advance, is not going to be controversial for the most part, I don't think. I really just want to go through the history of Jerusalem. Start from the beginning, and we'll learn about it. And I don't think you can understand Jerusalem unless you know the historical importance of it, unless you understand the spiritual significance of it, even the legal significance of it. And we'll see, what does Jerusalem mean for us as Jewish people? And I think that will start giving us an idea of what this is all about. So we're going to start from the beginning, and we're going to bring it up to date. The liberation of Jerusalem in 1967, 55 years ago, is only one chapter of the story of Jerusalem. It's not even the last chapter. The story is going to continue, is continuing. What is the Jewish vision for Jerusalem in the future? So let's really get this kind of general perspective of Jerusalem. God willing, it's going to be a wonderful class, an enjoyable class. So I want to begin with a little video just to get us into the spirit of today's class, and then we'll dive in. So if one of you don't mind, Lance, want to get the lights back there? And here's a little video.
אנחנו יושבים על הרכב שצופה אל העיר העתיקה ועוד מעט אנחנו עומדים להיכנס אליה. העיר העתיקה של ירושלים שמאז כל הדורות חותמים עליה ושואפים אליה. אנחנו נהיה הראשונים להיכנס אליה.
ברגע זה אני יורד במדרגות אל הכותל. אינני אדם דתי, מעולם לא הייתי, אבל זהו הכותל, ואני נוגע באבני הכותל המערבי.
All right, it's a beautiful video. It just shows you the moment, and you know, these are soldiers. This is recordings from the soldiers' radios, and you know, this is very not typical of the of radio chatter. In fact, I read that so the commander of the unit that stormed into the old city, his name was Matagor. Matagor was 27 years old as a commander. It's unbelievable to just look at the ages of these soldiers. The young people, the commanders are 27, the actual soldiers are average age 21. You have a 19-year-old pilot. It's like crazy stuff going on. Okay. So on an army radio, everything is in code words, right? You don't say anything explicitly. So for example, Mata Gor's code name on the radio was Talmud. Kan Talmud. He says, here is Talmud. Talmud is his name. Okay. The Lion's Gate, I think, was Damascus, if I'm not mistaken. That was the code name for the Lion's Gate. But when he gave the order that we should go into the Lion's Gate, he says, we're going into the Lion's Gate. He says, at that moment, all standards, everything about our army just fell down. This became a very raw moment. And just to hear that soldier saying, I'm not religious, but here I am, I'm touching the kotel. It's such an amazing, you really feel it. So what are we feeling over here? Let's start going through the history. And the goal is that in the next hour, we should make it all the way from the beginning till today. What's the story of Jerusalem? The story of Jerusalem, when does it begin? 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? So if we want to start from the beginning, and by the way, in your books, you can take a look at that. We're talking about West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. It's actually very, very helpful. Look at page 92, and you have here a good map of exactly what's happening. So this is Jerusalem. On the left side is West Jerusalem, and that became the Green Line, right? What's known as the Green Line, 1948 borders, or 49 actually, the Armistice Line, that's left. And as you'll see, the Jewish community built up some neighborhoods on the west side. Mea Sha'arim is famous, Rehavia, okay. East Jerusalem, that's what Jordan captured, and the old city, which is in the dead center of this map, surrounded by the wall, that is in Jordanian hands. Okay, let's begin with the history over here. Interesting fact, number one, if you look in the 5 books of Moses, you will not find the word Jerusalem even once. It seems, oh, what's going on? If Jerusalem's so important. Not once in the 5 books of Moses. It speaks about it, it makes reference to it, but it never actually says those words, that one word, Yerushalayim. It doesn't say that. In scripture, you have it a lot. So once you get to the books of the prophets and the writings, then you have it a lot in the other books of scripture. But 5 books of Moses, the Torah itself, there's no mention of Jerusalem, which is an interesting fact. And we'll talk a little bit about why a bit later in today's class. How does the Torah refer to Jerusalem? It speaks about it ambiguously, in the place that God will choose. So if you read the Torah, you know that there's some place, and it mentions this many, many times, there's a place that God is going to choose, or has chosen, but doesn't tell you what. Place that God chose. That is the scriptural description of Jerusalem, place that God chose. But it's very, very interesting. That's something so important to us. You know, there was once there was a New York Times columnist who wrote an article, and what he did was, this article was actually pro-Israel, and it said he made a count. How many times does it say Jerusalem in the Jewish Bible? How many times does it say Jerusalem in the New Testament? How many times say the word Jerusalem in the Quran? And by far, the Jewish Bible had that word Jerusalem, by far, many more times. But not in the 5 books of Moses. That's the irony. Okay, let's start talking about some history. So the first place to look at, Maimonides summarizes for us the history of Jerusalem itself, Temple Mount, and Maimonides is going to go backwards in time. All right, this is not chronologically. This is, how do you say it? Counter chronologically? Retrospectively. Very good. Okay, that's a good word. So text 2, page 94. Let us begin. Pam, would you like to begin?
Okay, Isaac was bound and prepared as a sacrifice on the temple's site, as it is said, go to the land of Moriah. And in Chronicles, it is said, when Solomon began to build the temple of God in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where God had appointed and where God had appeared to his father David, on the site that David had prepared to build the temple, on the threshing floor of Anunah, the Jebusite, according to an anonymous Jewish tradition, the site upon which David and Solomon built the altar on the threshing floor of Aruna,
Arana or Aravna.
is the location where Abraham built the altar on which he prepared Isaac for sacrifice. Also, according to tradition, Noah built an altar on this site when he left the ark. Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices on an altar on this site. Adam offered a sacrifice there after he was created. In fact, he was created from the soil taken from this location. Our sages said man was created from the place where he would find atonement.
There we have it. So we have a bunch of events over here, and it goes retrospectively. So the first thing that happens over here is this is the very place where the world begins from. The beginning of humanity, we all know the story that God, on the sixth day of creation, forms man, takes dust from the earth and forms man. So, interesting question, where did that dust come from? Could it come from anywhere? It came from the Temple Mount. From the very spot, which is a very precise spot. We actually don't know where that precise spot is today. There's a very precise spot on the Temple Mount where the altar was. That spot is where the very body of Adam, really the origins of all of us, are from the Temple Mount. That's number one. Adam, it says, creates an altar for God. It happens there, that offering. Cain and Abel, there's a famous story, right? They both offered sacrifice to God on that mountain. Noah offered after the great flood. David and Solomon offered their offerings there and also built the temples there. And the binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac is a key moment because that was the strongest, the harshest test that God gave to Abraham. And that was a clinching moment that made the Jewish people. So right over there you see there's a lot of historical significance to this place.
Is the first temple there also?
Yeah, this is all the temples, all two of them. All two temples. Yeah, that's right. We'll be talking about the temple soon, but even pre-temple, this is even before we're talking about the birth of the Jewish people, or maybe just the beginning of the birth of the Jewish people. This is the key location. So if we really look at the Bible, so we're going through the key events of the Bible, most of the significant key events happened here. Jacob has his famous dream, and he sees a ladder going up in there, and Jacob's famous dream, that happens here as well on this mountain. So it becomes a very, very significant place, and it's no wonder at this point why we look at Israel, and why we look at Jerusalem, we say, this is a holy place, right? So this is number one. But let's talk a little bit more, bring it to the concept of a Jewish capital. What is the idea, when do the Jews make this into their capital? What's the relationship between the Jewish people and Israel? So, fast forward a little bit. The Jews leave Egypt, and they go wander for 40 years in the desert. You know why it took them 40 years? Because they were using GPS. God precision system. Okay. It didn't work so well, but eventually they got there. 40 years later, they get to Israel. At the 40-year mark, Joshua then is leading the people. Moses died in the desert, never actually made it to go into Israel. He saw Israel, didn't go in. And the Jewish people start conquering the land of Israel. And it says that there were 7 indigenous native tribes that lived in Israel, and the Jews conquered all of them. All right, we spoke last week about the concept that before Jews wage a war, you first make an overture of peace, and that happened to a degree, but the ones that refused, the Jews said, if you don't agree to our peace deal, we're gonna come in, and they came in and they conquered Israel. They conquered all of Israel besides Jerusalem. Interesting. The very first time the Jews actually conquered and settled the land of Israel, they did not have Jerusalem for many, many years, actually. Let's read that in text 3, straight from scripture. And here you have one of the very first times where the word Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, is mentioned in the Bible, from the book of Joshua, written by Joshua. All right, text 3, and Jeff, go ahead, page 95.
As for the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. The Jebusites dwelled in Jerusalem alongside the children of Judah to this day.
So Joshua is writing this text in the present time. And he says, we weren't able to drive them out. And although we have the entire biblical land of Israel in our hands, the Jebusites, again, this is, right, they're not around anymore, right? Jebusites are not around anymore. And they dwelled in Jerusalem. Okay, so there's an obvious question over here. You know, the Jews are going and conquering, and they're being very, very successful. And we know there's this whole wonderful, fantastical story that happens in Jericho. The Jews are successful conquerors. For some reason, they can't get Jerusalem. Why not? So it's an interesting story. The Jews and the Jebusites have history. There's an ancient oath, not an ancient curse, an ancient oath. Okay, we'll get to this soon. Okay. Abraham had a run-in with a king whose name was Avimelech. Avimelech was the king of the Jebusites, the predecessor of the Jebusites. And there's a whole story. Abraham had a run-in with him. But at some point, when Abraham, his name and his fame was growing, Avimelech wanted to make a treaty, a peace treaty, a pact with Abraham. And they settled on this oath. Abraham made an oath to Avimelech. And the verse in the Torah says, swear to me that you will not lie, which means you will not do an injustice. Don't do an injustice to me or to my son or to my grandson. 3 generations, not my generation, not my next generation, 3 generations, the Jewish people had an oath that says you cannot touch the Jebusites. So it's interesting. In the year, the Jewish year, 2884. Okay, right now it's Jewish year 5782. All right, so 3,000-ish years ago, give or take a few hundred years here and there, you'll get there somewhere, right? More or less. So the Jewish people come into Israel, but living in Jerusalem, that is the place of the Jebusite tribe, Jerusalem, and the Jews are bound by this oath. And there are still grandchildren of Avimelech there in Jerusalem. So it's an interesting thing. The capital being Jerusalem comes much later. Initially, the capital of the Jewish people is actually all over the place. I'll go back over here. This was a tabernacle. The tabernacle is what the Jews had. It was like a traveling temple before the temple was actually built by King Solomon many years later. We'll talk about that soon on the Temple Mount. And the Jews traveled with a tabernacle through the desert and also for the first few hundred years in Israel. And wherever the tabernacle was, that became the capital of the Jewish people, or the central location of the Jewish people. So it was in different places, in Gilgal or Shiloh or Nov or Gibeon, all places in the West Bank actually, right? Which is the real biblical heartland of the Jewish people. So this is where the kings were, this is where Jewish action was. Jerusalem is not in the picture, right? Because of this oath. So in Joshua's time, the Jebusites inhabit Jerusalem, and the oath is still in effect. Okay. And this is the year, let me make sure I'm getting it right, 2482. 2482. Okay? This is not English years, this is Hebrew years. All right, so which is a little bit complicated, but it's okay. You don't have to keep the math up. Comes along King David. We finally have King David. Many, many years later, 400 years later. So Jews are in Israel for 400 years, and Jerusalem is not even on the map. The Jews don't touch Jerusalem because of the Jebusites. Okay. King David comes. He's a powerful king. He was the first king of the entire Israel. So Israel was divided into two kingdoms. There's a kingdom of Judah, there's a kingdom of Israel. King David is the first king that rules over the entire united Jewish people. And what he does is, he was then in Hebron, in his times, the Jewish capital was Hebron. What he does is he moves it to Jerusalem. And he goes and does the exact same thing what Joshua couldn't do 400 years ago. He says, now's the time. Any third generation remnants from Avimelech have died by now. And by the way, I don't know what the diet was like, but people in biblical times lived for a lot longer than people do today. So you had some people who were third generation and just, hung around for a while. But King David is finally representing the entire Jewish people, which is key. He's a powerful king. He has the means to do it. And he says, it's finally time to go and take Jerusalem. And at this point, in King David's time, there's no third generation descendants of Avimelech anymore in Jerusalem. So he goes and does the exact same thing. He goes to the Jebusites. First, makes an offering of peace. When they say no, he goes in and he successfully conquers Jerusalem. And from then, Jerusalem is called our capital. What year is this? This is the year 2884. In our calendar, 877 before the Common Era, BCE. So, how long are we talking about? 2,800 years or so? 2,900 years almost? That's how long Jerusalem is our capital. King David conquers it. There's no temple there yet, just it happens to be our capital, and he makes that capital. Now, something interesting. All the land in Israel was split between the 12 tribes. So you lived in the land of your tribe. So if you were from the tribe of Judah, you lived just around Jerusalem. If you were from the tribe of Zebulun, you were in the Haifa area, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so you lived in your tribal land. Jerusalem, King David did something very interesting. So you would think that when the Jewish land expands, you have to now split it between the tribe. Who does this go to, right? You have to figure out where it goes. And he says Jerusalem is tribeless. Nobody owns Jerusalem. Jerusalem is equal to all the Jewish people, right? I guess similar to like what Washington is for us, right? There's no state that owns Washington. It's a district for itself. It's DC, District of Columbia. So nobody has the right to say, I have more of a right to this place, you have less of a right to this. No one tribe has more of a claim to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is for all the people. And as King David writes himself in the book of Psalms, he says, Jerusalem is Ir shechubro lo yachta. Jerusalem is the city that brings all the Jewish people together. The one place that binds us all together is Jerusalem. You could say that practically, this was no man's land. It was everybody's land, equally. And we'll soon learn more how in Jewish law, this idea of nobody owns Jerusalem, every single Jew has equal right to Jerusalem. We'll see how strong that idea is going to be soon in a moment in Jewish law. This is what King David does. And this is the moment, just about 2,900 years ago, Jewish people have this as a capital. Okay. The story continues. Story continues. King David, as we said, yes. You have a question?
No.
Okay. King David, by the way, I'm just moving through a lot of facts over here, but feel free to stop me. And you'll see we're trying to get up to date. King David is the ruler of Israel for 40 years. He's in Jerusalem for about 30 years as his capital. Towards the very end of his reign as a king, a plague breaks out amongst the Jewish people. Without getting into too much of the backstory, David did something wrong. And as a king who represents the entire people, his wrongdoing caused spiritually that a plague should fall upon all the Jews. Jews are dying because of this plague, and he turns to God through the prophet and says, what do we do? How do we get rid of this plague? The prophet in his days was, and in the English language it's a little bit confusing, his name was God. Now God, G-A-D, not God, all right? It's gonna get confusing. God told God, God told, so we have to, there's God as in God, and then there's the prophet God. One of the 12 tribes was God in English. In Hebrew, it's God, the Ashkenazi Hebrew. So It's not that popular of a name right now, is it, right?
Yeah, well, Israel it is.
In Israel,
Yeah,
right,
Israel.
because we went back to bringing back all the biblical names.
Yeah, right.
Right, so God is now pretty right. But here in America, it's not such a popular name anymore, God, because this prophet's name was God. So the one who's communicating messages between God and King David is the prophet God. What does God the prophet tell King David to do to get rid of this horrible plague? Let's jump to text 9. All right, text 9, the story of Jerusalem continues. And Tom, we are up to you, page 102. Keeping you on your toes over here.
Prophet God came that day to David and said to him, "Go and build an altar to God on the threshing floor of Arnah, the Jebusite." David went as God had commanded, though God Enron.
Okay, so the name is, let me just tell you right now. The English name is Arana. I guess King James Bible decided that. The Hebrew name is Aravna. So make that U into a V. Aravna. That's the name from now on, okay? Go for it. Continue. Aravna.
Aram looked out and he saw the king and his servants approaching. Arnaud went on, prostrated himself before the king and said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David responded, "I have came to purchase the threshing floor from you, to build an altar to God, so that the plague will cease from the people." Arnmod said to David, "Let my lord the king take the threshing floor and use it as an altar and offer to that which is pleasing to his eyes. See, the oxen for burnt offerings and the threshing tools and the tools of the oxen for wood. All this Arnam, the chief, wished to give to King David." Arnam said to his king, "May your God accept your sacrifice." "No," David said to Arnam, "I insist on paying for it. I will not offer my God offerings for which I did not pay." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for the 50 silver shekels. He built there an altar and offered various offerings to God. God accepted the offering, and that plague upon Israel came to an end.
All right, so here we have a little story. We'll get back to the Jebusites. So King David owns Jewish people, are in command of Jerusalem. But there's one area, it's a little mountain with a flat threshing floor on top. That's all it was known as, the threshing floor of Aravna, because Aravna owned it. And he held what we now know as a Temple Mount. And then it was simply a threshing floor. Threshing is basically, the way it worked was, you would grow wheat, and you had to separate the chaff from the kernels and all the other stuff, which is called threshing. You have to separate it, you have to break it all apart. So what they did was, you lay out all this produce, I guess wheat, all the stalks, out on this flat area, and you bring a bunch of animals, a bunch of cows, which have flat feet, and you get them to trample all over it, and that breaks it up, and that's the art of threshing. That's what Aravna did. Aravna was a chieftain of the Jebusite people. Now, what happened? What happened was, so again, let's think about this. King David already conquered Jerusalem, but for some reason, even though he conquered Jerusalem, he doesn't have the Temple Mount. So why is it that this Aravna, the Jebusite, still holds a Temple Mount? Okay, we'll get there in a second. But what happens is he goes to Aravna and says, "My God told me that I need your space, your threshing floor, to build my altar for God. I want to buy it from you." Aravna was a nice guy. He was a peaceful man. We'll see that in a moment. That's why he didn't get kicked out. He accepted the terms of peace, so King David didn't conquer and take away his land. And Aravna says, "Your God wants my space. My little threshing floor is going to become your God's altar. Take it for free. Take everything. Take the space. Take my animals. Take my tools. Take it all." King David says, No. For God's altar, I'm not taking no gifts. I'm paying full price. So he pays. And he makes the offering. He builds an altar. The plague ends. And this is the Temple Mount. This is the moment Temple Mount comes to the Jewish people. Okay. Now, here's my question for you. King David, the Jewish people have already conquered the city of Jerusalem. Why is Aravna still in control of his threshing floor? So there's two answers. The simple answer is, very simply, Aravna, based on Jewish tradition, Jewish law, you cannot fight anybody without first offering peace. So King David comes to Aravna and says, I'm conquering Jerusalem, but I won't mess with you if you accept my peace terms. Most of the Jebusites said, go fly a kite. Or they said it more explicitly, whatever. However you say it in Jebusian, whatever, right? In the Canaanite languages. So King David comes in and conquers them. Aravna, the chief, he's a sweet guy. He says, sure, I don't mind making peace with King David. I like you, King David. You're a nice guy. We could be on good terms. So King David doesn't conquer. But when he wants it, he has to now come and pay. So that's a simple answer. The simple answer is Aravna accepted peace, so King David didn't conquer. There's also a deeper reason. Here's where we start getting a little bit of the flavor of the identity of Jerusalem. Let's read text 10. This is an important text on page 104. And where are we? Joey, go for it.
Scriptures relate in Samuel in the Chronicles that King David purchased the site of the temple from Aravna the Jebusite. It is clear that this location was not taken earlier from Aravna, possibly because we had accepted the peace overture of King David. There's a deeper reason why the site was not previously taken from Aravna. It appears that it was God's will that the holy site, where the divine presence was destined to reside for all eternity, should not be taken by force, even permissible force. Moreover, King David did not want to accept the site as a gift. Rather, he insisted on paying full market value, and he wanted that all of Israel should thereby have a portion in the holiness of all sites.
So there's two reasons here. A simple reason and a deeper reason. Simple reason, Aravna made peace. So he's not going to get conquered. Okay, there's a deeper reason. This is going to be the center of Judaism. This is going to be the center of the world for the Jewish people. And this center of Judaism and all that it represents, God did not want that the premise of it should be violence. The essence of the Jewish people is peace. The essence of our physical center has to be peace as well. And here's where we get a certain idea. The word Jerusalem, where does that name come from? Jerusalem?
Peace.
So what does the word shalom mean?
Peace.
Peace. Yerushalom, Yerushalayim. Half of the word Jerusalem means peace. And here we have the first idea. The essence of Jerusalem, we're going to see this theme recurring. The Temple Mount has to be peaceful. It cannot be taken by force. And this is the reason. And here we see King David says, I'm going to buy it fair and square. We're going to own it. So let's start making a little bit of a buildup over here. The Jerusalem itself doesn't belong to any tribe. It's a place of unity. Temple Mount is not taken by force. It's bought fair and square peacefully. We fully own it. And if you take a look at the very end of text 9, I just want to point this out to you. Last paragraph of text 9, it says, so David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 silver shekel. In fact, if you keep on looking around and dig around in scripture, you will find that King David actually collected 50 shekel from every single tribe. 12 tribes, total 600 shekel. He paid 600 shekel for the threshing floor. That's interesting. King David, we know, was very, very wealthy. And in the royal coffers, he could have easily come up with his own 600 shekel. But what does he do? He says, this is not my property. This can be the collective property of the Jewish people. So here we have two themes of Temple Mount. Number one, it's a temple of peace. It's an area of peace. It was not acquired by force, and God said it cannot be acquired by force. And number two, it's a temple of unity. It's bought with funds collected from all of Israel, from every single Jew. So here we're trying to see some of these themes. And as a little bit of a side point, I want to read this next text. The Midrash says something very, very interesting, and it's such an ironic text, because if you contrast this Midrash with the reality on the ground today, it's quite interesting. So Debbie, text 11 on page 105.
There are three locations regarding which the nations of the world cannot harass Israel with the plain that is stolen. Cave Machpelah, the holy temple, and the resting place of Joseph in Shechem. Cave Machpelah, for it is written, Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price that Ephron had asked, 400 silver shekels. The holy temple, for it is written, David paid a Ravnah for the site. Joseph's burial place, for it is written, Jacob purchased the plot of land from the sons of the ruler of Shechem.
So it's so interesting. The Midrash says, all of Israel, people could come to us with a complaint. You conquered it. Who gave you the right to come in? 3 places. We paid fair and square, and the Bible is our receipt. Everybody, all right? The cave of Machpelah in Hebron. Abram bought it from Ephron. The whole story is there in the book of Genesis. Temple Mount, as we just learned, David bought it from Aravna, and Joseph's burial space, which Jacob bought from the sons of Shechem, which the Jewish name of that place where Joseph is buried. Sorry, let's just say Joseph. Oh yeah, it's a Joseph burial space. Jacob bought from the sons of Shechem. Till today, it's called Shechem. The Arab name is Nablus. So Nablus is the right. The funny thing is, what do our sages tell us? People could come and contest any other area of Israel. These 3 spots, we paid for them. And what are the 3 top most contested places in Israel? These 3. That's the irony. The cave of Machpelah, Temple Mount, and Joseph's burial space was just recent, a few weeks ago. The Arabs burnt it and vandalized it, right? Every few years they do it. Horrible. Specifically this place, they always torture it. It's horrible. Such a desecration.
Machpelah is in the West Bank, right?
All three.
All three
All 3 are West Bank.
Well, not Jerusalem.
Listen, if we want to use a modern definition of the West Bank, which is what Jordan had on the West Bank of the Jordan River, Old City, Temple Mount was part of it. So all three are hotly contested today. So that's the irony. Okay. What happens there? So the Jews have Jerusalem. King David conquers it. King David buys the Temple Mount. And on the Temple Mount, God says, make an altar. This is the destiny of this location. And King David doesn't just build an altar, he builds an entire temple around this altar. So King David spends his entire life creating the blueprints and designing and just thinking through, literally designing every single detail of the Temple Mount project. But towards the very end of his life, God tells David, you cannot be the one to build it. You cannot be the one to build the temple. You're going to have to first die, and your successor, your son, King Solomon, he has to be the one to build it. And King David was very, very hurt by the news. This was literally his crowning achievement. His dream should be that he is the one who ultimately builds the Temple Mount. Should build the temple. And God says, look, David, you're a man of war. We know that David already from a pretty young age, I mean, not as young as most people think, but from a pretty young age, we had the famous story that he takes down Goliath. And from then he became not just a king, but like those days kings, he was a man of war. He was a professional of military victories. He had a lot of blood on his hands. And God says, you haven't done that with evil intentions. That's righteous blood on your hands, which means, you were meant to do whatever you did. But even if you were right, a man of war, a man of blood, cannot be the one to build a temple. And God says, your son Solomon, God says, I'm going to give him the gift of peace. And indeed, in the days of Solomon, he commanded a tremendous peace of all the other kingdoms around. He never once had to fight. The Jewish people had full peace and tranquility in the days of Solomon. God says, you'll get the benefit and the credit for designing the temple, for the vision of the temple, but the actual building, Solomon has to do. And that's what does. King Solomon, finally, 400 and some years after the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, builds the Jewish temple, the holy temple, on the Temple Mount. What's King Solomon's name in Hebrew?
Shlomo.
Shlomo. What does the word Shlomo mean? Shalom, Shlomo, peace. So again, we're seeing the same theme. Temple Mount that cannot be taken by force, has to be bought peacefully, built peacefully, and King Solomon is that one, Shlomo, Shalom, Yerushalayim. He is creating that temple. And at this point, this is kind of where Jerusalem finally matures. Before I write a biography of Jerusalem, right? So how does a biography? It begins with infancy, the formative years, teenage years, until finally fully developed. So Jerusalem itself, going through the biography of Jerusalem, it's a story. It slowly unfolds. There's a formative process where slowly Jerusalem takes on its identity. Finally, we are there. This is the capital of the Jewish people. This is not just the capital. This is the center of every single part of the Jewish people. Socially, this is the center. All the Jews meet here. This is what brings the people together. In general, I read this once from a sociological perspective. Every collective needs to have a geographical center. It's like every religion. You have to have, where's your pilgrimages to? Where do you center around? A nation has to be something which, an icon, a figure, a building, something. A place on a map that this unites you. So for Americans, what is it? I don't know, Washington, D.C., even the Statue of Liberty. There's a certain icon, there's a certain iconic thing of it. This is, we surround around this landmark. And Jerusalem was that for the Jewish people. Socially, that's where you met all the Jewish people. That's where you got in touch again with your tribal identity. Economically, it was very important. Religiously, that's where the courts were. That's where the king was. That's where you get all your direction. So this is where Jerusalem really starts taking on its identity. And at this point, I want to go through with you some of the laws about Jerusalem. And this is very, very interesting stuff. Jerusalem is not just another place. It is a very important place legally. In Jewish law, there's a lot of laws specific to Israel. And I want to go through them with you a little bit. So these are mitzvot and laws which are unique to Jerusalem. Very, very fascinating stuff over here. Number one, every single Jew had the commandment to make 3 times every single year a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Temple. And this happened on the 3 main holidays, Sukkot, Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot. So if we had a temple in Jerusalem, we would all have a mitzvah to get on a plane and travel to Jerusalem for these 3 holidays. And you met every single Jew in the world there. Practically everybody was there. Men and women and children came, even children came. So it says, babies don't need to come. And there's a whole debate in the Talmud. You got there yet? Chagiga? You've done it already. I'm looking at you, Debbie. You've done Chagiga, right? In the daf?
Yeah,
It's right there, page 2 or page 3. Okay, it's okay. I know, the Talmud, I know. It all becomes a blur at a certain point. There's a debate there. At what age should a child start coming to Jerusalem? According to one of the opinions, if the child could walk. If the father could hold his hand and he could walk. And if you've ever trekked and hiked around Israel, that's not an easy straight path. It's rocky, you got to go up and down. So if a child could walk and the father holds his hand, he has to go. Another opinion says if he could go on his father's shoulders, that's the age. So what is that, 2, 3? You're already going. Okay, so you met every single Jew there. That's law number 1, the pilgrimage. So this was a place that Jews were always going to. And one of the practical reasons of the pilgrimage, it gave every single Jew the opportunity to plug back in, get back to that energy, see all the people, see the temple. You felt godliness, you felt the spirituality there. This really was your center of gravity for the Jewish people. Law number 2, which is very, very interesting. In temple times, society, the economy was known as an agrarian society, an agrarian economy, which means the entire economy was driven by people having land, working in the land, selling your produce, etc. And there's a lot of mitzvahs in the Torah, which all revolve around your agriculture, the field, your produce, etc. In general, there's a cycle in Jewish law of 7 years. In fact, we are ending the 7-year cycle this year. Rosh Hashanah is going to be the first year of the new cycle coming up. Okay. Next year. Next year's a Shemitah year, or this year's a Shemitah? This year's Shemitah. This year's Shemitah, next year's Hakel. So next year is year number 1 of the 7-year cycle. And part of the 7-year cycle is that the Torah gives you different laws of what you need to do with your agricultural output for those years. 3 out of 7 years, there's something called a tithe. Usually you hear the word tithe and it means you got to take it, you got to give it away to somebody. No, this tithe is called Maser Sheni, the second tithe. It simply meant they had to take 10% of your produce, bring it with you to Jerusalem, and you eat it in Jerusalem, period. Don't give it away to anybody. You bring it. And if you're worried that your stuff are gonna rot by the time you make it to Jerusalem, then sell it for money, bring the money to Jerusalem and buy something in Jerusalem and eat it in Jerusalem. And you see this idea, bring the Jews to Jerusalem. Jews have to plug back in. Jews have to feel connected and have to get the energy from Jerusalem. Law number 3, very interesting. So of course you can imagine, if you live in Jerusalem, if you have a house in Jerusalem, you're getting a lot of visitors. It's hot rental. It's the hot rental, how do you call it? The hot rental market, right? Airbnbs, you can be making a lot of money in Jerusalem for Airbnbs. Law is no Airbnbs in Jerusalem. You have to host people for free. You can't make money, because what's that message if you're making money from somebody else coming to visit Jerusalem? The message is what?
Or you're creating an obstacle or disincentive to doing it.
You're creating an obstacle, number 1. And okay, I have another thought in mind, but that's good. What else? The message is, I own this place more than you do. I have a home here, you don't. And the message is, no, every single Jew belongs in Jerusalem. So even if you have a house far away, you come here for free. This is all our home. So it's a beautiful message. You're not allowed to rent. So, but there was an incentive program. The temple itself gave gifts to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem after every single pilgrimage as a little incentive, but you're not allowed to give money or accept money for staying over somewhere in Jerusalem. Law number 4, it's a holy city, and nothing impure may ever be in the city. So a corpse was not allowed to remain overnight. Till today, if you go to Jerusalem, Jerusalem has a very quick turnaround. If somebody passes away, that evening latest is the funeral, and there's no funeral home in the actual biblical borders of Jerusalem for this reason. And no one's buried there either. There's no cemetery in Jerusalem. You got to go outside of the boundaries of Jerusalem to get buried. The only exception to this rule is the kings that are descendants from King David, and one prophet, a prophetess. Her name was Huldah. She's buried in Jerusalem. That's it. Besides that, you're not allowed to be buried there. I just want to mention over here, there are no house rentals. Till today, I have to tell you, I once spent a week in Jerusalem. I was 13 years old, and I stayed a week with distant cousins who are what the news would call ultra-Orthodox. Those scary people. Mea Shearim, if you know what I'm talking about, that's the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. I have distant cousins who are, not Chabad, but we won't get into the exact social structure of the Orthodox community, or the ultra-Orthodox, which, by the way, some people use as a slur. It's used as a slur in the media, like ultra-Orthodox, like crazy, radical, fundamentalist. That's the image given. Okay, so I was there, and you really see it. In Jerusalem, people are unbelievably hospitable, like more than anywhere else. You just walk through the streets, there's such a vibe. It's a very special place. I have to tell you, from the week I was there in Jerusalem, I realized that Jerusalem has a certain smell. It could be it was just coincidence that while I was there, but literally the air in Jerusalem smelled different than the air in Tel Aviv or the air in Lud, nearby cities. Just you literally smelt it. It was a different place. So I think this law, which is not in effect anymore, this is only in biblical times, but I think that spirit is still very much there. I for sure felt it. Okay, corpse will not remain overnight, no graves, right? And number 6, which is very interesting, spouses can oblige to relocate. Okay, according to Jewish law delineates very clearly what is grounds for divorce, what is not grounds for divorce. So somebody says, I want a divorce. Why? I don't know, I'm bored of this relationship. Jewish law would say, I'm sorry, you don't have a right to divorce. There has to be a reason. So Jewish law goes into detail. When does a spouse, either a husband or a wife, have the right to schlep her spouse or his spouse to a Jewish court and say, I want a divorce, and the Jewish court's going to say, you're right, you get it, and we'll enforce it. We'll make it happen. And when does the court say, I'm sorry? Figure this out. This is not grounds for divorce. Generally speaking, let's say there's a spouse that says, I want to move to Florida. The other spouse says, no, I love winters in Michigan. That's the scenario. The wife says, I want to go to Florida. The husband says, I'm sorry, I want to stay here. Is that grounds for divorce? The answer is no. Oh, I'm sorry. This is something you get, Jewish law wants to figure it out. Let's say a spouse says, I want to move to Jerusalem. The other spouse says, no way. The other spouse says, Adam, I want to go to Jerusalem. This is the only time when it comes to relocation where Judaism says that's good enough of a reason for divorce. If the spouse is adamant and even wants a divorce, this is grounds. Jerusalem is special. You're gonna say no to move to Jerusalem when your spouse is adamant? I'm sorry. Jewish law sees that as pushing the boundary, which is so interesting. I'll tell you, I know, I'm aware of a case where there was a domestic issue. One of the spouses wanted a divorce, and the Jewish court says, you know, according to Jewish law, this issue is really not enough grounds. It's like, you know, it's interesting that it's a whole area of Jewish law. What is the grounds where somebody could say this is something which is offensive enough to me, the divorce is on the table, and when is it yes? And this is very fascinatingly something where Jewish law says that's already pushing the boundary, you could do that. So these are just a few laws.
Bro,
Yes,
a couple of questions. One is
sure.
about the no graves. Isn't it Mount of Olives there?
Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives is right outside of the biblical boundaries of Jerusalem. I'll tell you something interesting. I also want to let you know. Today we look at Jerusalem and we know there's the new city, the old city. By the way, has anybody here not been to Jerusalem? Not been? Okay. Everybody else has been, more or less? Okay. So today we look and there's the ancient city, which looks like it's been there for thousands of years, even though those walls you should know are only like 500 or 600 years old. The walls surrounding Israel. And so there's a new city, there's the old city. But the biblical boundaries of Jerusalem are actually larger than the current old city. So there's areas which today are outside of the walls of Jerusalem, which are really part of the original biblical Jerusalem. And we know where those boundaries are. And we'll see, in those areas, there's no Jewish cemeteries.
And also about the no house rentals. I mean, there are a lot of apartments for rent and houses for rent now.
You say now, yeah. Yeah, a lot of these laws were only by temple times.
So even someone who's observant now could rent their house?
I believe so. I believe even according to Jewish law now, this law is not in effect. And what we're seeing over here is Jerusalem is special. It's a different type of place. Okay, let's keep on going. Let's continue the story. King Solomon built a temple. This is the first temple. It lasts for 410 years exactly. 410 years in, the Babylonians come around and destroy it. And this becomes the first destruction of the first temple. Built by King Solomon, stands for 410 years, destroyed by the Babylonians. At that point, talking about 2,500 years ago, is when the exile, what's known as the Babylonian exile, begins. The Purim story happens in this time period between First Temple and Second Temple. There's only 70 years in between. It's a pretty short exile, which means most people either live their life remembering the old temple or live to see the new temple. It was a pretty short exile, and it wasn't even such a traumatic exile. We're going to talk soon about the current exile, which is post-Second Temple. It was much more traumatic. After 70 years, the Jews have the right to return from exile, come into Israel, rebuild their second temple. It stands for 420 years. It becomes a very beautiful temple. There's a whole history. King Herod comes and remodels the whole temple and makes it a beautiful temple. The Talmud says somebody who has not seen the temple of King Herod has never seen a beautiful building in all their life. That's the statement of the Talmud. And in the year 68 or 69 of the Common Era, close to 2,000 years ago, the Romans come and destroy it. And this really brings us to the current stretch of our relationship with Jerusalem. This is where Jerusalem leaves from being this biblical temple-style center with all the energy that comes with it. I just want you to imagine, our sages tell us that there were 10 miracles that you could witness daily in Jerusalem. You know what that means? You could literally walk into Jerusalem. You didn't have to believe. You saw it. There's no such thing as believing in Jerusalem. It was reality. You saw godliness. You saw spirituality was just as real as the physical world. You're witnessing miracles happening predictably. It's a pretty unbelievable thing. Comes the destruction, and the Romans did a very good job. They really destroyed the place. But the Babylonians didn't destroy the temple. They caused damage. But in fact, a lot of the temple was still pretty intact. So when the Jews came from exile, from the Babylonian exile, they actually had a pretty easy job. They were also very, very poor. So they just had to kind of, fix it back up from being a little bit of a dump, from being a little bit destroyed. The Romans came and literally razed the entire city. The entire Temple Mount, and the entire city of Jerusalem was in total ruins. And this brings us till today. The Jews never left. Jews never left Jerusalem. Jews never gave up on Jerusalem. The next phase of the relationship of the Jewish people with Jerusalem is the one remains of the Holy Temple, which is what? Which is the Western Wall. Here's where we have the idea of the Western Wall. Our sages tell us a tradition, and the tradition predates the destruction. So it's an amazing statement. In general, the Jews knew that destruction could happen, and to a certain degree will happen. They knew it. The prophet spoke about it. There's clear indications in our tradition there's going to be an exile. And the Midrash tells us that God made a promise to the Jewish people. No matter what happens to the temple, one part will never be destroyed. And what's that one part? The Western Wall. Okay. Comes Vespasian, and after Vespasian comes Titus, and they destroy the temple, and they're going after a full-on destruction. And they're not listening to any Jewish legends, right? These are Romans, doing the Roman business. But what happens? The only wall of the Temple Mount that is entirely left intact is the Western Wall. The other three walls were destroyed. There may be small little patches that survived, but the wall was destroyed. The Western Wall remained. And this became that connection point between the Jewish people and our center of the universe. Let's read text 12 from the Midrash, page 106. Stuart, are we by you?
Yeah. Behold, he stands beyond our wall. This refers to the western wall of the Holy Temple, which God swore would never be destroyed.
There we have it. It will never be destroyed, and that's really what the Western Wall is for us. And for the past 2,000 years, this is what the Western Wall is for us. It represents the concept that in essence, maybe the building of the temple was destroyed, but the energy of the temple is still always there. And in that sense, it's still alive. It's still real. The spirituality, the power of the temple, whatever it had, we still have the Temple Mount, and we still have the spirit of it. And with this, I want to go to the reason why Jerusalem was never mentioned in the Torah. And God, it's only referred to as the place that God will choose, or the place that God chose, or the mountain that God will choose. But it never says the word, Yerushalayim. This is where it is, Jerusalem. Why not? So there's a few different reasons. There's a practical reason, there's a few practical reasons, and then there's a mystical reason. Reason number one, why the name is never mentioned, is because if the nations would know that this is our capital, they'll battle for it. The pragmatic rationale is keep it a secret, and then we could go and take it when it's time. But if everybody knows that this is our capital, what's going to happen? Other people are going to want to take it. Number two, nations would maybe ruin it. If you look at Jerusalem, it's not like any other capital. You can't grow anything. It's not good for fields. There's no natural water there. There's nothing. What could you do there? It's a very barren land. So it's already not good. It's not a good location for a capital. The nation would know that this is a Jewish capital. They would destroy the place, make it totally uninhabitable. Number three, if the Jews knew that Jerusalem is the chosen spot, Jews would fight over it. It would cause discord amongst the tribes, amongst the Jewish people. They would fight over homes. Before King David went and conquered Jerusalem, nobody ever knew that this is that place that God chose, that the Torah tells us that. But then there's a deeper reason, a mystical reason. And this is, I think, this is what Jerusalem means for us still today. Because Jerusalem is not just a physical location. It's not just a physical location. A physical location, a geographical space could always be destroyed. A geographical space could always become obsolete. Could always become history. This is good for a history book. But Jerusalem is more than just a place. It's an idea. It's an energy. It's an energy that translates into a space. It's also an energy that translates on the human condition, psychologically. Our sages speak about the idea there's a Jerusalem in every single Jew's heart. The very point of your heart is a place called Jerusalem. And here's where I want to take apart the word with you. What does Jerusalem mean? The word Jerusalem has two words. Yira Shalem. Yeru Shalayim. Yira Shalem. What does Yira mean? Anybody with Hebrew? What does Yira mean?
Fear.
It can mean fear. What else can it mean?
Awe.
Awe, okay. Yira also means to see. To see, vision. What does Shalem mean? It means peace. What else does it mean?
Complete.
Complete wholesomeness. That perfect vision, 20/20 eyesight, absolute clarity of a Jew, the place within a Jew's heart, the place within a Jew's soul, where there's a certain sense of absolute clarity, of purpose, of vision, of identity, and every Jew has that. That's Yerushalayim. That's you. And the real reason, if you want to know why Jerusalem captures the heart of a Jew, is because the very essence of your identity is meeting its geographical space as well. Yerushalayim. And at the Kotel, at the very spot of the Temple Mount, even more. That's really the ultimate reason. Practically speaking, from the destruction of the temple, traditionally, according to Jewish law, most Jews don't go on the Temple Mount. Now, a lot of Jews do, but according to Jewish law, it's really frowned upon. The reason is very, very simple. This is the holiest place on earth. According to Jewish law, there's also laws, prerequisites before visiting Temple Mount. The biggest current modern obstacle to going to Temple Mount is that you need to be ritually pure. Ritually pure. Now, ritual, spiritual purity and impurity is not something that, it's not like dirt. It's not something you could look at. There's no science to measure it. It's a spiritual idea. But if you have ever been in contact, not even direct contact, if you've ever been in the same building as a dead body, that's a form of impurity. The only way to leave that impurity and become pure again, ritually, spiritually pure, is through a whole process. That process is impossible to do today. So if you've ever been to a hospital building, good chance there's a dead person. If you've ever been to a cemetery, if you've ever even passed by a tree, passed under a tree, and the tree is also hanging over, canopying over a cemetery, that is enough to transfer spiritual impurity to you. And in that state, you're not supposed to go in the Holy Temple. The Holy Temple is still a holy place. The holiness never left. And for that reason, Jews don't go on there today. Now, there are loopholes. If you still want to go on there, there are ways to maybe do it, but it's very, very complicated. And out of reverence, Jews really don't go. And that's really where the Western Wall becomes our connection point. It's the last remaining wall, and it is the space where you can get closest to the temple. There we go. Okay, the Western Wall. It's part of the retaining wall around Temple Mount. I want to show you two videos. These are videos from the 1920s and 1930s that show the Jewish people by the Western Wall. So you want to close the lights? This is a quick video. Two quick videos. You got it?
Yeah.
Here we go.
Behind the Mosque of Omar is the Wailing Wall, where the Jews still lament the fall of Solomon's ancient empire, which the Romans destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago.
From here we pass along a narrow street to another place of sanctity. The Jews, who never enter the Haram proper for fear of desecrating the Holy of Holies, come here to its walls, which are said to be part of the foundation of Solomon's temple. Since the Middle Ages, they have come from all over the world to this, the Wailing Place, and have stood before these stones to pray and to lament the downfall of Jerusalem, the venerable capital of the Israelite Empire.
And there we see, this is the relation the Jews have with the temple. We Jews have been going there for 2,000 years. In fact, just an interesting thing, the real Western Wall is much longer. The current Kotel is only this tiny part. The rest is underground, the top did get destroyed, but the entire wall from here all the way down till there is still in existence. Most of it was already built into houses. Most of the Muslim quarter, a lot of houses, one of the walls of their house is literally the Western Wall. The exposed space is only this, and post the 6-Day War, they opened up the plaza. This is what it looked like in temple times. The Western Wall was to the back of the temple, the closest to the Holy of Holies, which is right there. And in fact, further down here, there's another small area of exposed wall, which is known as the Kotel Katan. That's in the Muslim quarter, and I've been there. It's a small little passageway behind the house, the alleyway, and you have exposed wall there. Yes?
Why is the area just to the right of that? Yeah. Why is that not considered just as holy? I realize that this part is closer to where the temple was, but it seems that everybody is in that one place, and to the right, there's nobody.
So this exact spot is more just because traditionally this is the opening. This was the part of the Western Wall where Jews had access to. It seems more by coincidence. Okay, and this takes us, I want to go through what happened to the Temple Mount, to the Western Wall, to the city of Jerusalem in the 2,000 years since the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So, post-Second Temple, Jerusalem was first ruled by the Romans. The Roman Empire turned into the Persian Byzantines, the Christian Byzantines, or the Byzantines, I think some people pronounce it that way. But I know, I call it Byzantines, but I heard some people say Byzantines, whatever. And then, I think after about 700 years of Christian rule, Roman Christian rule, finally the Muslims come back in. And it's back under Muslim rulership. And this is also a story of Jewish access. In the year 135, about 75 years after the destruction of the temple, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, which was a horrible anti-Semite, expels the Jews out of Jerusalem. Till then, Jews were still living in the area, in Israel. He expels everybody. He says no one is allowed to go to the temple, to the Western Wall, besides on the day of Tisha B'Av, which is, by the way, this Sunday. So this makes this a very timely class, to go there. And by the way, that's when the Western Wall takes on another name, the Wailing Wall. What's Tisha B'Av? What's the 9th day of Av? It's a day when we commemorate the loss, and Jews would cry. They would go there and see the destruction. So it turned into a place of wailing. By the way, that's the Arabs called the Wailing Wall. That's what they would say. Once a year, the Jews were allowed to come in, and what would they do? They start wailing. This is the only one time a year the Jews had the right to go there. Interestingly, the Christians banned us from the Kotel. The Muslim rulers in the year 638 allow the Jews back. Now we have full access again. And this is in general. Whenever the Christians rule, the Crusaders, they kick us out and they expel us. They don't let us go to the Western Wall. The Arabs always let us come in. Okay. In the year 1517, for 400 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled over this piece of land, in fact, the whole Middle East. Next step is in 1917, World War I, Ottoman Empire is totally dissolved. Then you have what's called the British Mandate of Palestine. The videos that we just watched are from the Jews going to the Kotel during this period of time, during the British Mandate of Palestine. In these years, the British Mandate of Palestine, 30 years, Jews were allowed to go to the Kotel, but very interestingly, Jews were not allowed to blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. The British didn't allow it. Again, can't provoke any violence. So we see this is an old theme going on in Jerusalem. You can't hurt anybody, can't offend anybody, can't blow the shofar. Okay, 1948. This is how we began today's class. 1948. There's a war of independence. I believe it was seven Arab nations come and fight against the infant state of the Jewish people, very tiny land, horrible war. Over 6,000 Jews killed, 1% of the population total. And what happens is the Jordanians capture East Jerusalem and they go against the armistice agreement. According to the armistice agreement, they were supposed to allow the Jews to always visit the Western Wall. They didn't. They expelled all the Jews, and the Jews were banned.
And other religious.
Right, yeah, all the religions, right.
It was actually an illegal occupation.
That was illegal, right? That was in total, right? That was in violation of the agreement, of the
The
armistice.
rest of the world can hear.
That's right. And at that point, it became this yearning. The Jews were so close. We have our own state, and now we lose Jerusalem. And this was the pain the Jews lived with for 19 years. There's a house outside of Jerusalem. It's called the White House. And that roof was the only roof you could catch a glimpse of the Temple Mount. You couldn't even see much. You saw the tip of the trees, and you were told those tip of the trees were on the Temple Mount. Can you imagine? Jews would go to the White House, not to see anything. You're seeing tips of trees so close, yet so far. And this is what brings us to today, to 1967. And over here, I want to show you this week's video. All right, so here we go. Here's the video of the liberation of Jerusalem. Let's get the lights again. This brings the story up to date.
From the dawn of civilization, armies arrived from the ends of the earth to lock swords over Jerusalem, the city that King David chose some 3,000 years ago as the capital of his ancient Israelite kingdom. 2 subsequent Jerusalem temples served the Jewish nation for most of a millennia from atop the Temple Mount. Their former site remains Judaism's holiest location until today. In the course of the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, the Jordanians occupied East Jerusalem, capturing the Old City and the Temple Mount, and expelling its Jewish inhabitants. A 1949 armistice agreement left this territory in Jordanian hands. But in violation of its agreements, Jordan denied Jews entry to the city and its holy sites. Jordan systematically desecrated and destroyed 58 synagogues, ancient Jewish religious sites, tens of thousands of graves on the Mount of Olives cemetery that had served the Jewish nation for 2,500 years. For 19 years, the ancient capital lay divided between Jordan and Israel, with 7 miles of urban border separating East and West Jerusalem. When war erupted between Egypt and Israel at 7:14 on the morning of June 5, 1967, Israel lacked the manpower and resources to fight on more than one front simultaneously. It concentrated its forces on the Egyptian front, leaving a single brigade to face Jordan. Israel hoped that Jordan would stay out of the fray.
We appealed to King Hussein and to other neighbors to stay their hand, and Israel would do likewise.
But Jordan had already mobilized 11 brigades on Israel's borders. It had invited Iraq's forces to join an attack on Israel, and it had signed a defense pact that placed its army under Egyptian command to better coordinate an Arab-Israeli war. At 9 a.m., at Egypt's urging, King Hussein ordered the indiscriminate shelling of Jewish Jerusalem and other targets. His planes bombed Israeli airfields. Israel bit its lip, hoping that Jordan was making a formal gesture of solidarity with Egypt, and that the eastern border would soon fall silent. But by 12:30 p.m., Jordan's offensive morphed from a rumble into a roar. Jordanian troops moved into southern Jerusalem's no-man's land and stormed Government House, the UN compound strategic to control of the city's south. Seeing her eastern border catch fire, Israel sent her wings ahead of her claws, first responding to Jordan from the skies. Jordan's airfields and air force were rapidly obliterated. Meanwhile, Israel scrambled to muster an infantry brigade from the north and to divert a paratrooper brigade from the Egyptian front. Israel did not intend to capture the Old City, and certainly not the West Bank. Its stated goal was to secure key roads to Jerusalem, strategic ridges and fortified positions that encircled the city, and to create buffer zones for the future safety of Jerusalem and its environs. Israel also planned to liberate the route to the Mount Scopus demilitarized enclave that included the Hadassah Hospital and Hebrew University buildings. Mount Scopus was located in Jordanian-held territory, but in violation of the armistice. Jordan had severely restricted Israeli access for close to 20 years. rendering the area unusable. In the afternoon of June 5th, Israel launched a surprise assault on Government House. It captured the compound within 25 minutes of fierce fighting, then moved swiftly to take the nearby Naknit and Pa'amon strongholds, so that Israel could take control of the road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. By 8 p.m., these missions were complete. Meanwhile, an Israeli armored brigade stormed the Tel El-Ful ridge that rises some 2,800 feet above sea level. The ridge was key to controlling the Jerusalem-Ramallah route. Fierce battles raged through the night, but by 9:15 a.m. on June 6th, Tel El-Ful fell to Israel. Early in the morning of June 6th, Israel fought one of its bloodiest battles at Ammunition Hill, a fortification that controlled the road to Mount Scopus. At 3:30 a.m., the battle began. Paratroopers advanced, exposed, without air or artillery cover due to the proximity to residential buildings. Barbed wire, minefields, stone-lined trenches, and cement bunkers formed an impermeable nightmare. Every few meters, Jordanian bunkers spewed relentless fire, often requiring hand-to-hand combat to subdue. Eventually, with all their officers dead, individual soldiers led the battle on their own initiative. As the sun rose some 3 hours later, Ammunition Hill fell as silent as a graveyard. 36 Israeli paratroopers had lost their lives, and today, Ammunition Hill serves as a memorial to their sacrifice. Israel was now free to approach Mount Scopus. At 9:30 a.m. on June 6th, Israeli forces approached the enclave and fought a second bitter battle to capture Mivtar Hill. They accomplished their mission, but 34 soldiers fell this time, along with scores of injured. Down south, Israel made its way to Jordanian Jerusalem's Abu Tar neighborhood. They arrived at noon and fought a lengthy battle against 5 fortified Jordanian positions. By 6 p.m., the IDF had completed their immediate mission. All roads to Jerusalem had been secured, and all enemy strongholds in the immediate area had been captured. The Jordanian forces in the Old City were isolated. At 7:45 a.m. on June 7th, the third day of the war, the IDF High Command issued a surprising order: capture the Old City of Jerusalem. 2 battalions attacked the high ground, overlooking the city from the Jordanian side of the Mount Scopus demilitarized zone, while a 3rd battalion headed for the Old City itself. At 9:45 a.m., Colonel Mota Gore breached Lion's Gate, and at 10 a.m., his voice crackled through the army radio, shouting ecstatic words that still ring in Israel's memory. The Temple Mount is in our hands. Minutes later, IDF Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren arrived to recite the poignant Shehechi Yanu blessing and to sound the shofar, as emotional paratroopers wept and smiled at the ancient stones of the newly liberated wall. The iconic images of that moment have become symbols of Jewish survival and of the nation's inextinguishable bond with the sacred city. A 2nd Brigade entered the city south through the Ashpot Gate to flush out pockets of resistance. At 11 a.m., the Jordanian governor signed surrender papers, and the city elders surrendered at 11:15 a.m. By 1 p.m., the Old City was under Israel's control.
That's where we are today. But the story doesn't end. This is one little chapter. We've liberated Jerusalem, and we're so much closer, but we're not there yet. And this coming Sunday is still Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the day of national mourning for the loss of Jerusalem, for the loss of our holy temple. And as much of access that we have to Israel and to Jerusalem, it's still not the vision. It's still not what we want. We always still pray that God should rebuild the Jerusalem of old, the Jerusalem of new, the new holy temple. And I want to conclude today's class with two final thoughts. One final thought, I want to read text 1 with you. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of this lesson's text. Text 1, page 93. The prophet Isaiah was the prophet of the Jewish people at the very end of the Jewish people's those last years before the destruction of the second holy temple. And his prophecies are full of prophesying what's going to be after the destruction. What's it going to look like when this place gets destroyed? He says beautiful words which capture the Jewish feeling, the Jewish relationship with Israel. Text 1, page 93. Lance, are we by you? Did you read yet? Then go. Page 93.
O Jerusalem, I have appointed the exiled Jewish nation as watchmen over your walls. All day and all night, they shall never cease praying for your welfare. Be not silent, you who remind God of Jerusalem's devastation. Give him no rest until he establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise of the earth.
So still when the temple is standing, Isaiah says there are people appointed to be watchmen over the walls of Jerusalem. Who are those watchmen? Us. We are the watchmen of Jerusalem. And the prophecy has not failed us. Indeed, the Jews never gave up. As we saw in the videos, Jews always went back to the Kotel. And he says, day and night, never cease praying. Don't be silent. Don't give God any rest until he brings back the glory of Jerusalem. So this Tisha B'Av is that day. And our sages tell us that whoever mourns for the temple will merit to see it rebuilt again. And one final thought. After the destruction of the temple, especially after the trauma, the Jews saw this is not like what happened by the Babylonian exile. This was traumatic. The deaths, the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. And they saw that years are going by, and they saw this is going to be a long and difficult exile. It's not going to be a quick 70-year ordeal. And the sages in the Talmud, post the destruction of the temple, they have a discussion. They say, Alma of the Haaretz. For what did we lose the land? What went wrong? Why did this have to happen? Let's diagnose the problem. And the conclusion of the discussion is the second temple, the Roman destruction happened. God's protection left the holy city of Jerusalem for one reason. There was prevalent, what's called in Hebrew, sinat chinam, senseless hatred. There's one type of hatred where you hate somebody and there's a reason, you know. And then there's something called senseless hatred, just animosity and negativity for no good reason. And unfortunately, the Jews in that age had that for decades. It was very, and without unity, we don't have God's blessings. Jerusalem, that place of beauty, of purity, that it can't handle. It can't handle that type of negativity. So we lost it. And our sages teach us, if we lost Jerusalem because of senseless hatred, what's going to make it come back? Senseless love. Let's love another Jew. Let's love each other. Why? For no good reason. Senseless. That's the ultimate message. So God willing, what happened in 1967 is only one step of the story. The story is not over. The story of Jerusalem is not over. The story of Temple Mount is not over. And the exact same way where we learned that ultimately our relationship with the hill, with the Temple Mount, has to be peaceful. God willing, the rest of the story is also going to be peaceful. No more conquest. We will come to a time of peace in the Middle East. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Next week is a very, very spicy class. This week we did it a little bit nicer, a little bit more of a relaxed topic. Next week we're going very controversial. We'll see you all next week. God willing, even before Sunday, even before Tisha B'Av, we will merit to Yerushalayim, Habnuya, the rebuilt Jerusalem, the coming of Mashiach, the rebuilding of our holy temple. And all this we could happily place back in the history books. God willing. Okay, thank you all for joining. Amen, amen. We'll see you all next week, God willing.